So thanks to the pandemic, our lives have seen a massive shift towards digital in the last 12 months. Online crime is about to overtake real-world crime in police statistics. Yet, the entertainment industry still seems to be shying away from digital topics. Although The Great Hack and The Social Dilemma have demonstrated the massive public interest and the potential for finding great stories in the digital world. We've got producers and an Emmy-awarded director to discuss why it's so difficult to produce good content about the digital and why we need more of it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session here today, our Hacker Hunter session about the question if data is boring. Maybe as a little introduction, Hacker Hunter is a real crime documentary series about cybercrime, and we're having a few from the crew here today. You can find it on YouTube on our channel, or you can find it in the program here during this event. Tomorrow Unlocked is a YouTube channel and production studio that is focusing on cyber stories and has a strong focus on cybercrime because we're actually owned by Kaspersky. And, well, why are we here today? The question that we're discussing today is data too boring? And I believe most of you here at this event would say, absolutely no way. I mean, data is exciting, it's important, it's valuable. But if you look at TV or Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, whoever you prefer to watch, you can still count the good productions that are discussing data or privacy or cybercrime on one hand. And the question we want to discuss today is, why is that? Why is that not changing? We invited 3 people who might not have the answer, but for sure they will have some strong opinions. And let me introduce. So with us today is Lara Maysa Ingram, calling in from Bali. She's a freelance filmmaker and photographer and learned filmmaking at the BBC and has been invaluable in finding and putting together stories for the Hacker Hunter series in the last 2 years. Hello, Lara.
Hi.
Also with us is Wael Dabbous. Wael is a director with a focus on impactful and sometimes difficult stories for UK and US television. He received a primetime Emmy for Frontline Syria Undercover on PBS. And I recently had the pleasure of producing Hacker Hunter Olympic Destroyer with him. Hello, Wael.
Hi.
And also with us today is Max Peltz. He's a founding partner at Lone Wolf Studios. His productions aired on Netflix, Showtime, Hulu, ABC, BBC, Sky, and many other international broadcasters. And he's our lead producer at Hacker Hunter. Hello, Max.
Hey.
Now, let me kick off with a simple question that goes to each of you. Is hacking sci-fi? Max.
It's a good question. I would say it's not. At least when I think about it, I think sci-fi for me feels very fantasy, very, I want to use the word epic because of all those films when I think of sci-fi and TV shows, Game of Thrones, The Matrix. I think with hacking, this is a very prevalent real world issue that is speeding at a rate that we're finding very difficult to manage and control. So I think the difference there for me is that sci-fi is fantasy and hacking feels very sort of real world issue. Yeah.
Lara, other opinions there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting question because I feel like hacking can be very sci-fi, especially if you look at, films that are more, fictional and dealing with narrative and that are more drama-based. So if you look at Black Mirror as an example, they have, really turned subjects like hacking, whether it's like hacking someone's mind or someone's brain and things like of that nature. They've really turned that into quite like a sci-fi like piece of content or a short film. But I think like generally speaking, it's, I don't know. I guess like many people have their different takes on it. You know, some people that are just very much like used to the industry, for them it's like, no, this is just real life, this is data, it's all kind of evidence-based, it's very factual. But I mean, even if you look at the most successful documentaries that have tackled hacking and cybercrime, you know, things like The Social Dilemma and The Great Hack, they have capitalized on this very like psychological dystopian element, which I feel like feeds in quite well to sci-fi films in general. So I think yeah, there's an interesting line between documentary and fictional portrayals of hacking, and it depends like where on the spectrum you are, I guess.
Thanks, Lara. Wael?
I think I'd have to agree with both Max and Lara. They're at opposite ends there. I think there's truth in what each of you have said there. I think ultimately, what we've seen is that science fiction is essentially someone's mind creating an edict, an idea, a target for the future, a direction in which we might be heading. You know, some things don't turn out that, as we've experienced, not a day goes by where you don't say to someone, "Oh, it feels like we're living in the future." You know, everything from our childhood seems to be coming true. From, you know, being able to video call as we are now from remote parts of the world. All these aspects that once were science fiction seem to have very rapidly become fact. So I think hacking just fits perfectly into that. A little bit of fiction, a little bit of fact, and certainly, hopefully not too dystopian, but we'll see.
Thanks. Wael, you got an Emmy for a film where you were actually traveling into a war zone, into a real war zone. So is making a film about, let's say, a real war or real war zone or a real tangible conflict more gratifying than making a film about something that is as intangible as cyber war?
I'm not sure about more gratifying. It's certainly more terrifying, I'd say. A real war zone, as you can imagine. It's you know, apt enough that at this moment in time, I'm currently busy on another project planning a potential trip to Somalia. So I guess when one's contemplating something like that, it's possible to consider tangible not to be a good thing when that tangibility could be bullets. So sometimes it's quite refreshing to when the warfare is virtual and a little more cyber. But no, certainly what excites us as filmmakers, what gratifies us, I think, is finding original stories, ways into subject areas that perhaps traditionally have been seen as boring, and data is certainly one of those areas that has been a bit unjustly tarnished as boring, when actually it's ultimately, as we all know, as we've all learned, those are just unfair misconceptions about boffins and jargon and whatnot. It all comes down to being able to tell a story with a human face in a unique and original way that will basically engage an audience.
So you need these human faces. Now, people working with data are very often stereotyped as being a bit shy. We see these stereotypes in films to people with hoodies sitting in a basement in a dark room. Lara, you are usually having the task in our productions to find people that in the end would sit in front of the camera and tell us stories. And I know lots of those people have never been in front of a camera before. Do you get the feeling that it's more difficult finding data professionals, hackers, cybersecurity researchers, whatever it would be, that would be willing and able to speak in front of a camera?
I mean, yeah, I think there definitely is that stereotype, and I think it kind of, in a way, makes sense because, a lot of hackers or, security researchers that are so deep in their work, I mean, it is quite an isolating job a lot of the time. I mean, you're at a computer for hours and hours decoding like very specific, formulas, and it is quite like a solo journey. But at the same time, I think there's been plenty of examples on our show where we've had people that are, from that group that are actually incredibly charismatic, that are very emotionally intelligent, that are actually super helpful as well. I mean, I found, like, speaking to a lot of people from this industry, they're generally so happy that we're actually choosing to make a film about this story or about a specific cyber attack, because they're living it day by day. They know how real these threats are and the damages that it could have, whether that's financial losses or whether that's on society as a whole. So for the most part, I found them to be incredibly willing to speak on camera, just for the purpose of actually just spreading more awareness on these issues, because I think they've spent most of their careers trying to get the attention of Microsoft and all these other big corporations, big manufacturers of products that are connected to the internet, for example, saying, look, we found all these vulnerabilities, like, please do something about it. And it's like, oftentimes they kind of get ignored until a big attack happens, and then they're sort of forced to do something, like the NHS, for example, with WannaCry. But even then, they didn't, really make that much improvement on their system. So I think for them, it's actually quite a relief almost to see that, like, filmmakers are taking more of an interest in their work, and they're often just very happy to cooperate and just spread more awareness about these issues. But of course, there have also equally, maybe not equally, but there have been a few cases where it's like they're super shy and they really don't want to be on camera, but they're incredibly helpful in just off the record research calls and putting me in touch with other people. So yeah.
Max, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, Lara, over the course of 4 episodes, has done an amazing job, and I've spent time talking to contributors of all different kind of trades, from sheriffs to baseball teams in Mexico. But I've got to say that the contributors on the Hacker Hunter series have been some of the most passionate and easygoing people you could ever want to speak to. There's always this daunting feeling when you're going into a project, about the access, who's going to speak. They're probably not, and you find reasons in your mind that they won't speak to you because you're a filmmaker, they won't trust you. And it's always that horrible feeling when you pick up the phone and you first speak to somebody. And I remember there was one instance on the Hacker Hunter series that I picked up the phone and I spoke to a guy in New York. And as with all the others, he was incredibly helpful in connecting us with many different contributors, which helped us piece together the story. But also there's a passion from all of these people to share their work and their story. They are constantly trying to get this out there. It's a real sort of untapped subject, and sometimes I feel they might feel a little bit underappreciated. It goes so underground that it helps to have a filmmaking team wanting to spread the word.
Are they maybe underappreciating themselves? I remember a camera team once, or a producer once, contacted me and said, could we do a story about this hack, and could we come to your offices at Kaspersky and just sit with your researchers and look at what they are doing all day and what it's like? And I went to the researcher and was like, guys, can we do that? And they were like, well, we can do that, but honestly, we will be sitting there all day looking at a screen. We're not even picking up the phone and talking to each other because we would use messengers. You won't get anything from that. I have a feeling that maybe some other industries, even if it's as boring as this, would be easier in turning it into something that is really looking beautiful and maybe have less issues with making their work look more spectacular than it is? Well, is that something, do you get that feeling, or is it maybe too easy to say that?
I think that's a very good point. I think we use the word boring there. I think ultimately it's not so much that it's boring. It's that it's for a filmmaker it's difficult. It's just a little more challenging perhaps than other industries. You do as a filmmaker come to accept that certain subject matters and topics do perhaps lend themselves more naturally and more easily to being translated onto screen, onto film. That we touched on war zones. That's a conflict zone. We know what the stakes are, the visuals. There's action. There are heroes. There are villains. You can follow a narrative unfolding. Whereas with people sat at computers, you sometimes have to just think outside the box and come up with your own visual way of telling the story. You mentioned true crime earlier, and I think with the work that we've done on the second series of Hacker Hunter, we heavily lent on the idea of translating a story into a true crime whodunit style mystery, and ultimately, this was Olympic Destroyer. For those who haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil the film, but this is a malware attack on the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in 2018. In the industry, it was known pretty much as one of the most deceptive malware attacks of all time. It was largely unreported, though, and undocumented at the time to an extent. The International Olympic Committee weren't too proud to talk about it. So we faced a story there of a gripping, compelling mystery with no visuals. So that I think was an example of having to essentially come up with a way of telling that, a way of creating the visuals. What do you need when you're looking at a whodunit? Ultimately, you need a murder scene or a crime scene. So we essentially, as the team, Max, Lara, and I, and yourself, we really thought outside the box and came up with a way of inventing a crime scene. I think that's one way of tackling these subjects. I don't think you ever face a situation where a topic's too boring. It's simply coming up with a unique way of telling it, of approaching it.
But is it then that so you have to come up with a unique way to tell such a story, while in many other cases it would be quite straightforward? There was a crime scene, you go there, you film it, you have something to film, you can reconstruct the crime scene quite easily. As someone said in one of our films, you can't arrest a piece of code. So that is similar, like you can't film a piece of code. Well, you can, but it's really boring because it would be a screen with a piece of code on it. While in that film, in the Olympic Destroyer, had the code running in the background at a wall in an office that we staged to be a crime scene. But still, you have to be a bit more creative, and it might be a bit more difficult to find these visuals. Is that maybe a step that stops people from looking at these stories because you find the visuals much easier in other stories?
Well, I'll start by saying that, when I first learned that we were doing these 2 episodes, and one was about Olympic Destroyer, I was very excited about the potential visuals we might be able to use. I grew up watching great films that had epic surroundings of snow, and you got The Living Daylights, which is the James Bond film. Then you think about the Grand Budapest Hotel, Free Solo, but whereas those visuals might work for those films, they don't necessarily work for this one. This one's a story about, as Wael said, a malware attack on the Pyeongchang Olympics. Snow and the Olympics is a part of the story, obviously, but it's important to find the balance between those visuals, because it can become quite jarring if you're going over vast landscapes of snow and I think Wael did a wonderful job at balancing those visuals, especially that that shoot that you just mentioned with the code running down the screen with the snow in the office. It was it came out fantastically, and I've got to say it was one of the most challenging shoots that we've ever had to organize. But the results, you know, make the film. And just to go again on what you were saying about visuals and having something unique. You see, Phil, the most popular cybersecurity films today, The Social Dilemma and The Great Hack, all have something that's unique about them. The Social Dilemma had these wonderful scripted sequences which really bring you in and attract you to one certain character. It's a hybrid model. You don't see it very often in documentary, and it's very hard to pull off, but they did quite well, and I think they were just nominated for a BAFTA actually yesterday. The Great Hack had stunning visual effects, which kept you hooked. I think there's an opening sequence which uses it very well, and you know, you can't take your eyes away, you're gripped. As said before, the issue around cybersecurity has become like very prevalent within society today. There's always been a fundamental issue with executives and networks and platforms being able to visualize it. It all has to come from the filmmaking team. And I think if you have a great story, which we had, a great team, which we had, and it was a really sort of a good environment with collaboration, I think you've got a higher chance of success than you would if you're just setting out with one of those things. There's going to be conflict everywhere. And I think those are the fundamental, a unique vision from the team, great environment of collaboration. You know, it really helps. It's a trusting. It's a trusting from a whole circle.
But now we've several times mentioned The Great Hack, The Social Dilemma, great films and very successful films too. Now, I would have expected the success of these two films would maybe make it easier for other similar films to be commissioned. But then we were in a conversation with a TV station recently, doing a kind of social dilemma about cyber attacks and cyber espionage, especially. And we got quite far. And in the end, it went to a content committee for final approval. And the reply from there was that the general feeling was that it might feel very static and computer-based, even with a narrative involving national-level hacks and repercussions felt by many of us. Part of the issue was it's quite a hard one to picture if you don't know anything about that world, and it may be hard to comprehend just how big an impact it can have on us. So that gives me the impression that these two very successful films about data haven't really changed mindsets. Max, how long will it take to change such mindsets?
It's a very tough question, but I think it is changing. I think the landscape is changing. You know, the more these crimes happen, the more people are going to be worried about it, and the more Hollywood is going to try and capitalize on that. You know, it's very tough right now for people to visualize these stories. You know, they immediately think about computers and people in hoodies, and you know, where is Brad Pitt and these sorts of things. So I think it will change. It's hard to get away from the true crime boom, and I know this is an element of true crime, but there's a general lusting for blood in documentary true crime that we don't have, because you know, it's a much more sophisticated way of doing bad things. But it takes one person. You know, you read these articles about the great crime documentary series that didn't exist before the Jinx and Making a Murderer, and it's a leap of faith from the executives at these companies. And And, if you come across the right person at the right time with the right vision, a lot of trust can be put in that. And I have to sort of check up, because I'm very confident that there's stuff being made right now within the cybersecurity space by Netflix, by Amazon. Sometimes they keep it very under wraps, so I wouldn't be aware of it. But I'm sure the Great Hack and the Social Dilemma are opening up those different avenues.
I actually, many years ago, the executive producer of The Great Hack came to us. I was still in the PR department at Kaspersky at the time, and they wanted at that time to do a film about the Sony hack. So they came to us and said, we read about the Sony hack. It's amazing. It's game-changing. We have to do a film about it. And I, at that time, was much less impressed by the Sony hack, because from a cyber security perspective, it wasn't so outstanding, right? Maybe from a political perspective, it was. They changed their course several times and ended up doing the film they did, and it was a great film for sure. But thinking back of that, maybe there's also a misunderstanding between what we as data industry think are interesting stories and what filmmakers think are interesting stories, and maybe we're trying to push the wrong stories. Might that play a role too, Lara?
I mean, I think like one of the very common things that I would hear just from like our contributors, or even just in research, if you look at like tech and cybersecurity, cybercrime as, an industry, it's definitely one of the fastest, rapidly growing industries or sectors. And something that I hear very often is that, especially when it comes to, for example, making arrests, it's like the tech industry is just zooming by, and then like the legal frameworks are just not quick enough to adapt to that change and that growth. And I think maybe in the same way, there's a similar parallel between, the tech industry and cybercrime, cybersecurity industry with film. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like filmmakers, they, it's a completely different industry, right? So of course they have their own vision of what will make a good story, whereas, cybersecurity analysts and professionals, they have completely different perspectives on, what's going to be a game changer for their industry. It's like even Olympic Destroyer is a really good example, because if you look at the data on the ground, or like the sort of real life consequences of it, the way that it actually affected people on the ground in the Olympics, it was kind of like, ticket machines weren't working and like this, and it kind of seems like a little bit like, okay, almost not trivial, but it was almost like, oh, like you're sort of expecting this massive like thing of, some kind of real physical, tangible consequence. Whereas looking at it from a cybersecurity point of view, it was actually, the code itself was so, in a way, sophisticated with all of the false flags. And it was one of the first, like, I guess, iconic examples in cybercrime that false flags had been used to that extent. But then, of course, that goes, puts us more in like a political sort of story, which is like, okay, why would one country try to make a piece of code look like it was from another country? So yeah, I think there definitely is a gap, but I think that's just natural. But I think, like as Max mentioned as well, it's like the more that these cyber crimes and cyber attacks are perpetuated, the more they will have real life consequences. And I think people nowadays, we're so immersed in our technology, which is like the Internet of Things and phones being like glued to our faces. I think it's only a matter of time before people, filmmakers actually really start to capitalize on these other stories that are, maybe not necessarily like the first thing that a commissioner would have in their minds today, but I think that we'll catch up soon enough.
I remember a situation a few years back when some of our researchers wanted to push a story, and it was about attacks on embassies all around the world. And I spoke to one of them, was like, okay, why is this amazing? And he said, because it's written in assembler. And I was like, yeah, okay, that might not be the the headline that people at the New York Times want to see out there, right? So I think, yeah, sometimes indeed the details that make something unique might not be headline grabbing enough. On the other hand, we had an interview recently for the film about attacks on COVID vaccine production and the response to that. And in that interview, the Interpol told us that some countries today have a ratio between cybercrime and real-world crime that is 50-50. But if you look at film and entertainment, the ratio is maybe, I don't know, 3-97 or something like that. Wael, do you think that a reason for that could also be that the film industry is simply lacking the, let's call it nerds, or more friendly, tech-savvy people who really understand these stories?
I'm not sure it's a lack of expertise in the film industry. I think somewhat going back to the feedback you had from the TV station that you mentioned earlier, I think ultimately between cyber specialists and filmmakers, you have these gatekeepers who decide ultimately what gets made. And a lot of them can be risk averse. You know, they need to see a real track record, a real hunger in audiences for something before investing heavily in that. The issue ultimately is that there can be a lag and a lack of trust, a lack of faith that audiences can care about a subject matter. And you know, the examples you've touched upon prove that audiences do care. Audiences do realize that these issues we're talking about are part and parcel of everyday life. They affect us all. So ultimately, I think the lack that exists is not so much in terms of expertise within the filmmaking industry. I think it's simply in terms of trust and confidence in audiences. And as Max mentioned earlier, that is rapidly changing. We're seeing that changing. That's the optimistic, positive part of that. 10, 20 years ago, Michael Moore, I think it was, who said that on a Friday night, your hardworking audience doesn't sit down in the evening and say, "Hey, let's put on a documentary and enjoy that." That wasn't something that seemed so alien to us all that someone would think of a documentary for entertainment. You know, he was highlighting the importance of filmmakers not being ashamed of making their work entertaining. And you know, in the same vein, right now we don't think that someone would sit down on a Friday night and say, "Hey, let's engage with that data and unwind." But ultimately, we can see from Amazon Prime, Netflix, all these streaming services, there's a massive tidal wave of true crime, of non-fiction output, and I think that data, cyber stories, I think time has come, and I think we're experiencing that timeline at the moment.
There's a completely other aspect of making films about data that is, I always found fascinating. It's the misrepresentation of how certain things in the digital world actually work. That's also why I asked, is hacking sci-fi at the beginning? Because honestly, in film history, hacking has in most cases been, at least in entertainment, sci-fi. So, Max, why is it so easy to step into the trap and, for example, portray hackers always as young men in hoodies who miraculously hack into a secret government system in 4.5 seconds?
I wish it was that easy. So, you know, I was literally the man in the hoodie in our film Olympic Destroyer. So, but I will say that Wael might feel differently to me. It's a trope, to be honest, that, you know, it's become that way since The Matrix or whatever the first sci-fi. There was a film called Hackers, I think, as well, which I saw years ago. But you know, it's about communicating the message to audiences in the easiest way they'll understand, and also, you know, the quickest way. You don't want to be camera on, man on hoodie for 25 seconds just to hit home the point. You know, it all comes down to what every film student and every person involved in the industry is told: show, don't tell. So people have this preconceived notion of hackers that manifests itself in one way, at least, as a man or a woman in a hoodie. So once the audience sees the flash of that, they get it. And what was so great about the Olympic Destroyer film was, it can be visually very boring to see that. It's been seen so many times, but we had the code with the projector, we had a different sort of setting, we had a stadium, we made it look sort of different, which engages audiences a little different.
So you would say it's audience expectations that we're playing with in this. But Lara, I mean, you've put a lot of work in research now, and also came up with a number of additional different approaches how you could display hacking. What are the key takeaways of those 2 years trying to find good stories in the data industry? How should we rather visualize it?
I think, just like with everything, there's never just one way to portray a person or a group. And I think that, over the years, it's become so clear. Actually, there is such a diversity in what we know as in like a mainstream audience as hackers. It's definitely a huge spectrum. And I think, there definitely are those like younger kids who start reverse engineering, online games at age 12, and, they might loosely fit into some of these stereotypes. But, then this ranges all the way to cyber criminal groups that are operating themselves very much as a business. And they're actually incredibly high functioning, very organized. Like, even sometimes they'll actually have like an HR person for like a cyber, it's like things that you would have in like a normal office. They've actually implemented that into cyber criminal operations because it is an operation. It's a big business, and it's never just one person. If you're talking about high profile or high level cyber attacks, it's always different players that are, positioned all over the world. And oftentimes they're very much actually isolated in their own roles. So even they themselves, even though they're all kind of different groups that are part of one specific cyber attack, even they won't actually know much about each other apart from, their IP addresses, for example, which again makes it very difficult when it comes to making arrests and trying to track people down. It's like, it is this like massive system that's operating on a much larger scale that we could ever imagine. And I think it's like, yeah, it kind of, even if you look at, the dark web and how some of these ads are put up, it's like, it almost just looks like Amazon, but it's just like Amazon for cyber criminals, where it's like, oh, here, you can buy this, specific stream of malware, and it's like got reviews and like even like a customer service number that you can call, and people will be there to help you, implement the attack. So it's like, yeah, I think that's one of the things that almost surprised me a little bit and fascinated me, is how it really is just like such a big business and an operation rather than this like one guy in a hoodie, although that still can be the case too. So it's just a huge spectrum, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's a big industry, cybercrime, and it is very professional. Yeah, we've just seen a report about COVID-19 vaccines being sold on the dark web, and it was also all about 5-star ratings and yeah, it's interesting. Delivery times, it is like Amazon. It is super interesting indeed. Just you can't pay with a credit card. That's a big difference. Well, if someone would offer you to either do a film about, let's say, a law enforcement agencies unlawfully ignoring privacy laws and using data they should not have access to track down criminals, or maybe even not criminals, who knows, or you could do a film about police violence, which would you do?
Well, I guess the the police violence subject and film is the obvious choice there, because as we've been discussing, the visuals are sadly quite obvious. They're there. There's the body cam videos that we've seen recently, the cell phone footage, all of these materials of shocking, unlawful killings of unarmed civilians. Unfortunately, for a filmmaker, do serve the purpose of getting a story across quite quickly, quite dramatically, quite effectively. You know, in recent years, I had the chance to make a film on police violence. That was called Law of the Gun. So I spent time across America with various police. I also spent time with victims of police violence, and you know, that was a story that I've told. So I guess having explored that subject, I would probably choose the very important and timely privacy story. Obviously, that would certainly entail having to think outside the box again and come up with a way of visualizing that story, visualizing that issue, and again engaging audiences. I don't think audiences need to be talked down to at all. I think we all at the moment live in a sort of slight anxious state of paranoia when it comes to our privacy online. You know, whether it's accepting WhatsApp new terms and conditions or all these issues. I think we're all aware of it. I think it's just a matter of empowering and informing an audience.
I think we have like 5 minutes left or so. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask a bit of a philosophical question here now. Do you think, and that question goes to everyone, jump on it whoever wants to go first. Do you think there's a very general misconception at the core of this whole thing that people, and I'm not talking about filmmakers or executives or whatever, that people believe that they could always disconnect from the digital world whenever they want, and then they wouldn't be affected by what's happening there anymore? And based on that, people might believe that what happens in the online world is, well, not really real. Is that an issue also for telling stories about this, that they might then not be taken too serious? Max, someone has to start.
Yeah, no, I'm just waiting for you to call my name. So yeah, I think, you know, when I look at least the people I know, family, friends, and we're sitting down, or in better times we were sitting down next to each other, scrolling endlessly on social media, I think it's very hard to disconnect from the digital world. I think once you're in it, you're there to stay. I have Twitter, and I must scroll through it at least 10, 15 times a day, just looking at the news. That's what I use it for. And sometimes I'll send the occasional really bad tweet. But I think you know, once you're hooked in, you're in. And I do think that there's a level of, at least from the majority, of blissful ignorance, you know, not actually wanting to know what goes on, because if you do unravel, I think it's quite scary. Like, you're going to realize that you've left quite a lot of information about yourself around the place that people can then use and build a model of who you are, target you for certain things. So I think that the more that awareness increases, and it is exponentially, the more people will start to take responsibility for that. I don't think we're there yet, though. I think we're still at a very young point of the digital age, at least. I think there's a long way to go.
Thanks. As this was a super answer, I'll cut this short, while Lara, if that's fine for you, because I have a final question that I still wanted to ask all of you, and we are close to the end. Which film or series about the digital world should people have seen? And so which can you really recommend? And please don't say Hacker Hunter, use something else. Wael.
Okay, now that you've ruled out Hacker Hunter, eliminates the top of the list, obviously. I'd have to say not specifically a digital cyber film, but a series of films recently on the BBC by Adam Curtis. Can't Get You Out of My Head. I think that series is essential viewing and feeds into this subject matter beautifully, especially part 6, which is called "Are We Pigeon or Are We Dancer?" Asks really important questions about the kind of world that we've created, what's led to this, and what the future may hold. And the cyber aspect feeds into that entirely. So I'd highly recommend that.
Lara?
I mean, I don't know. I really like psychological thrillers and like dystopian things, even though they can be quite dramatized. But I do find some episodes of Black Mirror actually so accurate. It's crazy. So yeah, I mean, for me personally, I'm always like very interested between the intersection of technology with psychology. So I think Black Mirror, you know, their episodes, they do like such a good job of telling that, and I think it really does grip audiences in a way that it actually does begin to filter these conversations and these issues more into the mainstream, where people can start to talk about, oh, like it's just like in Black Mirror, or it's like, you know, people kind of use it almost as a reference to describe things that are actually happening. So I think it's yeah, I think that's a good example for me.
And Max?
I hate to put one film or series over all the others, but watch all of them. But definitely watch Hackers, which was an old film that sort of 1990s, very sort of gritty version of Hackers that doesn't glamorize it at all. And there's no men or women in hoodies in that one. It feels very real.
Super. Thank you all for this interesting discussion. Unfortunately, the time is already up. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to us. You will see in the program that you can watch all these films that we've produced and that we've been talking about during this event on your own schedule. Thank you again, Lara, Max, Wael. It was an absolute pleasure. And everybody out there, enjoy the rest of the World Ethical Data Forum. Thank you.